everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the ANA eLearning Academy. We're so excited that you can be here with us. Thanks to all of our presenters that have put in all the time and effort to these presentations. Some of these presentations are normally 22 hours long, about 4 days during summer seminar, and they've crunched it down into about 2 hours, which is a lot of work. So thank you to all of them. During the presentation, you may come up with some questions. If you do, please either use the chat feature or the Q&A feature here in Zoom to send in the questions. They'll come to me and I will share them with at the end with Sam. If we have more questions than the time allotted, I will send them to Sam and he can answer them later on. So feel free to send any questions that you have. At the end of the presentation, I'll be sending out a survey. Please fill out the survey when I send it right after Sam is done talking so we can get the most accurate information from everybody. We want to know what you thought and all of that to help improve these for the future. So I want to turn this over to Sam. He's going to talk on the modern minting process, errors and varieties. Enjoy.
Well, thank you very much, Bree. Appreciate that. All right, well, welcome everyone to our ANA eLearning Academy session on the modern minting process, errors and varieties. When you come out for summer seminar, there'll be a much longer version of this with Dr. James Wiles. This is just going to be an overview because there's so much to talk about when it comes to the modern minting process, as you're about to see here in just a moment. So getting right down to it, we'll go over a brief history of what we call EV coin collecting, or error and variety coins. Talk about how modern coins are made using what we call the PBS process. I know a lot of you, when you hear PBS, you think the three major mints we have now: Philadelphia, Denver, San Francisco. But back in 1971, a great EV coin guy, Alan Herbert, came up with this method to really discuss or to classify error coins. So, and how coins are made. So we'll talk about PBS method of how coins are made and how things can go wrong when they're being made. We'll get into die varieties a little bit, one of my favorite topics in coin collecting, and cherry picking. We'll touch on some of the brief hints that you may need to do that as well. If for some reason this does not fill up the entire 2 hours, which it should, because I do have a lot of slides and a lot of information to go over, we will hopefully have some time at the end of this presentation for Q&A. But we are going to do another hour after this, from 2 to 3 p.m. Mountain Time, where we'll go a little bit more in depth through this presentation. And if anyone has questions, we could ask then, and we'll try and go a bit more in depth at that time. But again, there's so much to go over in just this brief presentation, so please bear with me, and hopefully all will go well. So anyway, guys. An EV coin, like I said before, it's one that varies in any way from the normal as a result of the minting process. Another line from Alan Herbert. This is actually printed in our Modern Minting Process, Errors and Varieties textbook on page 6, I believe, in that intro. So remember, it's one that results, it's as a result of the minting process. When you look at the coins on screen there, and at the ANA, we get a lot of people that think when they see something like this in their change, they hit the jackpot, they call us, and we have to crush their dreams instantly and let them know, no, you found something that's really cool looking, but it's damaged. And there are lots of forms of damage. A lot of people think, if they're not real collectors, a lot of times they're led to believe it's an error, it's worth a lot of money, when can I retire? We have to tell them that's not always the case. So, we can't really go in depth about a lot of these coins that you see on the screen right now, but just know that all of them are damaged, they are or altered. They are not a result of the minting process. So the coin that really started off the EV hobby in America, really big, was the coin you see on your screen right there. Most coin collectors, even if you're not an error or variety collector, are very familiar with this one. 1955 double die Lincoln cent, double die obverse, of course. Can't really get into too much of the background of how people were finding these, but it was really as change in packs of cigarettes from vending machines back in the 50s. Be really cool if you could find things like that in your change nowadays. But we'll talk about why you can't really, because the minting process has changed over the years. But First of all, like we said, the 1955 doubled, with a D on the end, doubled die-off versus Lincoln cent sparked widespread interest in what we call the Fido coins, the freaks, imperfections, defects, and oddities. And it really spurned a lot of overall popularity of coin collecting in the United States. There have been waves of it over time, but in the 50s, that was the thing that really got everyone into it. So in 1963, we had two collector groups devoted to the craft, cone, and NECA. And long story short, in 1983, they joined forces to form CONECA. And a shameless plug on the screen there, their website, conecaonline.org. Write it down, take a screenshot, remember that one. It is a very important website if you're going to understand these coins, error and variety coins, but also Variety Vista is another website. There's probably links through the conecaonline.org website that you can get to Variety Vista. So again, like we said, an EV coin is one that varies in any way from the normal as a result of the minting process. So what's the difference between the two? Truth be told, there's a lot of overlap. It's not always a cut and dried situation. You will find some things that you could classify as both. It's not always a real clear delineation. So the best way I could really tell it to you is what you see on the screen right there. If you consider errors as unique or just one-offs, anomalies that do not really repeat exactly due to some problem or mishap that occurred at any point or at some points in the minting process. You can have problems with planchet, die, and or stripe, all on the same coin. And of course, varieties are really occurrences that tend to repeat exactly due to an anomaly with one or more coin dies. I didn't say one or both coin dies because most coin collectors, hopefully you guys already are aware of the third side of a coin, the collar or the edge. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. Yeah, don't ignore those. So guys, what you see on your screen right there is a very rudimentary, very elementary example of the modern minting process. But I figured because we have such a diverse audience today, it'd probably be better to go with an example like this. I'll walk you through it real quickly, and then we're going to go in depth with some real pictures that have been taken at mints. And before I go much further, let me just thank Dr. James Wiles for providing a lot of the slides that you'll be seeing today in this presentation. So first of all, you can see that the minting process has to start off with metal. It's a big metal coil that is brought to a huge spool. It gets unwound, gets fed into a blanking press. Blanks are stamped out. The webbing gets sent off to be recycled. The blanks go on to be annealed or softened with a heat process. Then they get cooled slowly. Then they get washed, they get dried, and then they go on to the upsetting mill where they're turned into planchets. Planchets are what we strike coins on. The planchets are struck. An inspector is usually there to check to make sure the good coins go on to the counting machine. The bad ones get on to be rejected into a machine affectionately referred to as the waffler. And we'll show you pictures of some waffled coins a little bit later. So that is pretty much the minting process, in one shot right there, but let's get right on into it. Before that, it's very important to understand some things that have happened over time in the minting process. It'll really help you understand, especially if you're a die variety collector, what type of things you might be finding. So for example, in 1909, the mint bought a pantograph or a Janvier reduction lathe, where they started to employ a full hubbing technique for die production. Dates were punched into dies individually. As time goes on, in 1909, they realized if you include it as a part of the overall design element, it works out a lot easier. It's a lot faster, it's more consistent. But as a result, there are no more RPDs or repunched dates. So anything after 1908 that you're seeing where the date looks doubled, it's doubling that's on the die or the hub, but not actually as a result of an actual mint punch that was going in. In 1990, Mint marks were included as part of the overall hub design. They were no longer punched into each working die. So after 1990, you're not going to find repunch mint marks. If you see any kind of doubling on a mint mark, that would be a result of hub or die doubling, which in 1996, the Mint was trying to eliminate by employing a single squeeze hubbing process to make coin dies. So in theory, they got rid of some double dies, but anyone who was collecting in 2009, hopefully you guys remember some of the six-fingered Lincoln cents that were out there, or from the Denver Mint, there was a really big double die quarter from Washington, D.C. with Duke Ellington on the back. So moving right along with the modern minting process, remember planchet, die, and strike, or as we will go into this, talk about first how planchets are made, then how the coin dies are made, and then when they come together in the striking process. So when you talk about planchet making, first of all, understand that blanks are punched out of metal sheets and they're turned into planchets. Planchets for cents are no longer made at the mint anymore, not for a little over 30, almost 40 years now. They're provided by an outside supplier. The metal coils for other denominations are alloyed by an outside firm, but the blanks are still punched at the mint for those denominations. So first, in order to do this, you have to have metal in order to make coins. So we extract metals from ores that we find in the ground. And then we refine them and form them into ingots. And these ingots in various quantities, very specific quantities, are alloyed and formed into sheets. These big sheets of metal pass through a series of rollers to flatten them to the proper thickness for each denomination. It takes a little while to do this, but when you get it to the length that you need, or the thickness that you need, you get a really long coil, a really long sheet of metal that's, from what I've heard, about the length of about 10 football fields. So it's a lot of metal. And these coils are stored until they're needed for coin production. So the metal coils, when they come out, they're fed into the blanking press. So you can see on your screen now a picture of one of these rolling mills, and you can see at the top there where the machine is, you can see a series of rollers, and each time they're going through the rollers, each set of rollers just comes together just slightly closer so that it's thinning out the metal to the desired thickness for that denomination. And the picture on your right, you can see coils of this clad strip that's going to be used to make coins. So that big spool, or the coil feeder, they take that huge coil of metal, put it onto the feeder, and it gets fed into the blanking press. The blanking press, it doesn't just punch out one at a time. That would be horribly inefficient. So they use what's called a gang punch. It has many heads on it. It punches out several blanks all at the same time. So here's a picture of the end of the blanking press, and you can see what we call the webbing that comes out afterward. That webbing winds up getting cut up and scrapped, something that they affectionately refer to as bow ties. And these are pretty cool. Can't really get them out of the mint. It would be pretty difficult to do so. But these things are littered all over the mint floor. I had a chance to go to the Denver Mint back in 2006 when they were still doing private floor tours. And man, bow ties are everywhere on that floor. So what they do with the blanks next is they go on to, there's a lot of quality control measures in place. Again, the mint doesn't really want errors getting out. So they go through what they call the Riddler screens. It's a series of 3 tiers. First, the blanks go onto the first screen, and anything that's too large or correct size, well, anything too large will be caught on that top screen. The right size blanks and anything smaller will go below that to the second tier. That second tier has holes that are slightly smaller than the intended denomination. So the correct size blanks will stay on that second tier and go on to the rest of the process. but the other things that are too small, other little scraps and things that shouldn't be there, they wind up getting rejected to be recycled. So you can see on your screen the Riddler screens that they use. And then the good blanks go on to the next step, annealing. They get sent to a huge furnace that's about 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty hot. They go in there for maybe about a half hour, and then they are cooled slowly or quenched, different than tempering something where it's quenched quickly. They do that with die making, but not so much with coins because you want them to be soft when you strike them. You have to understand the minting process is a cold process or cold worked process. So you want to try and heat these up to soften the metal before that happens. It makes the planchets receive a better strike, and it's actually a little easier on the dies, so that extends their life quite a bit. So the blanks are heated, they get quenched before they're washed, and then those annealed blanks get washed and cleaned before heading to the upsetting mill. So the upsetting mill is where the blank becomes a planchet. It's where it puts on a basic or a proto rim on the blank. And it says, after upsetting, planchets for circulation quality coins are ready for striking, except for those small golden dollar coins. They wind up going on to a step where they are what they call burnished, where there are certain chemicals and little like shotgun pellets or BBs that are mixed in with that solution. Helps brighten up those planchets before they're struck. That's why they have that nice gold appearance, even though there's absolutely zero gold in them. Proof planchets, however, get special treatment before they are struck. So this is the Riddler, or I'm sorry, the upsetting mill on your screen right here. On the top left, you can see as the blanks are entering the upsetting mill, and it actually has what we'd call two dies or two big chunks of metal. You've got one that's stationary and another one that rotates. If you look in the top right, you can see a little bit easier picture where they enter as blanks. And you might notice as they go through, it gets a little bit smaller. That blank is squeezed to the point where it actually winds up putting this tiny rim on the coin. It actually also helps fold over any metal burrs that might be on the blanks. We don't want people getting hurt while they're trying to spend money while the coins are in circulation. So if you look at your the bottom photos there, you can actually see blanks being turned into planchets right there. That is the actual machine itself right there for the upsetting mill. And here's a pretty good picture to illustrate the difference. Remember, a blank, that was just the metal that was punched out of the sheet. But after that blank has gone through the upsetting mill, it is considered a planchet. Now, a lot of times in the hobby, I've heard people over the years refer to what they call a type 1 blank and a type 2 blank. So that's why I have the names up there as such, because some people will refer to them as a type 1 or type 2. Technically, and this is a very technical course, it's a blank or a planchet. So if you stick with that terminology, probably a little bit better. So that's how the planchets are made. Now we'll go on to the die making process. And of course, you have to understand, it says, we'll talk about it from the start, from artists to working dies, but technically it really has to start as legislation, but that's a story for a whole nother time. Can't get into right now. So once legislation is approved and a coin design has been approved, sculptors and engravers have a job of taking like a two-dimensional drawing and turning that into a 3D plaster model. Most die making can be done digitally. It's all done through computer programs. But a lot of times you would have an engraver working on traditional sculpture of about 15 inches in diameter. Really big, but it would be a large rendition of what the actual coin is going to look like. It's kind of hard to make a plaster sculpture really, really small. Hobo nickel carvers might know something about doing something like that. That's another story for another time. So a rubber mold is created from the plaster model that's made. When that mold is done, they take that and they fill it with epoxy resins to form a galvano. Now, galvanos used to be made out of metal through an electrolytic process, but it's a lot easier nowadays to use certain resins. A lot easier. So the reducing stage, this is where we're going to take that huge sculpture that we turned into a galvano and turn it into something that we can use to start the coin making process. So first of all, that galvano is, the design is transferred to a piece of steel that will become the master hub for this design. So if you look at the picture, it should say steel blank. That's not my misspelling. I blame Dr. Wiles for that one. But the Janvier reducing lathe that you see right there on the screen, the galvano is on one side and the steel blank is on the other. And as the galvano, I'll show you another picture here. As the galvano, it rotates very slowly. I mean, this process takes a good couple of days to do. Slowly, as it rotates, you can see a stylus. If you look at the picture in the upper right, you can see this stylus that traces the design of the galvano. It follows every subtle nuance as with the design. Every part of the relief is transferred to the steel blank on the other end. If you look at the picture in your lower left, you can see the die steel being engraved. That is what's going to become the master hub from that galvano. The picture in your top left is a picture of the galvano being traced and at the same time that die steel being cut to create the master hub. And if you look in your lower right, you will see a huge bundle of steel rods that will be cut to size to make die blanks, or the blanks of hubs as well. So again, when that master hub is created in relief, because it's going to look just like that coin will, it'll be an exact copy of that galvano, just much smaller as the intended size of the denomination. The master hub is placed in a hydraulic press and it's squeezed against a steel cylinder or a blank die with a cone-shaped tip. It actually helps the design just spread a little easier, and it helps transfer it a lot better, having it as a conical design at the top. And the master die is what is used to make working hubs. So you can see in the picture right here, a couple of Mint employees in the hubbing process. In the you got the big, huge furnace on the top left where they have to heat these things, and they're tempered because they're cooled very quickly in the vats that you see in the top right. The photo at the bottom left is the actual hubbing press, and that is what the die steel and the hub are put into. And at this time, they were squeezed. It would take a couple of squeezes to get the impression up to the full design that you wanted, to that full relief. And the die variety people probably already know that that's where a lot of mishaps can occur. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into die varieties. But you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, because it's backwards, that is a coin die, not a hub. The dies are backwards. It's a little tricky to follow, but here's something that might help you understand. So the galvano is traced. If you look at this picture, of course, the galvano is traced to make the master hub, which is in relief, or it's positive, it's just like the coin. That master hub is used to make your master dies. The master dies, you only want to make a couple of these. These are a negative impression of the coin. These master dies are then used to make working hubs. And you want to make several of these working hubs. I'll explain in a little bit why that is. From these working hubs, now it's a positive image, just like the coin again. From these working hubs, they will create working dies. Working dies are what strike coins. They're a negative image, and that is what is used to strike a coin. The reason for this process, the best way I can sum it up to you is anytime you might make a photocopy, let's say you take your original paper, you lay it down on a photocopier, you make a copy of it. Take that copy that you just made and now use that as your original. The copy that you get from that is going to be slightly less quality. You keep doing that a few times, you're going to notice you're going to lose a lot of quality really quickly. So the same is kind of true with die making and the hub making process. You want to have enough of them on hand so that if you have enough working dies, they're still going to retain a lot of that original quality from that master hub. So that's pretty much the main reason why we do that. I hope that made some sense there to you. So again, remember we said with the die making process, until 1990, mint marks were punched directly into the individual working dies. But in 1990, they were added as part of the overall design. And no, that doesn't mean they were individually punching mint marks into each coin. That would be impossible. They would punch them into the working dies individually. And up until 1996, the Philadelphia Mint was responsible for making and shipping all dies to all of the other branch mints. In 1996, Denver starts to make them for their use and production, as well as the dies that they would need for San Francisco. And they did this using what they called the single squeeze method. Because remember, we showed you that hubbing machine earlier. It would take a couple of squeezes of the metal to bring the impression up to the desired relief. In 96, we really have a method where they only have to push it one time, and you've got the die or hub already created within one squeeze. And it's supposed to eliminate die doubling, but doesn't always. So to sum that up, understand that your plaster model, the Galvanos, the master hubs, working hubs, and our struck coins are in relief. We're going to have to excuse the Indian head gold pieces for this conversation. But only the coin dies, the master die and the working die, are backward and incubes, where the design is sunk in to the die steel. So now we've got our planchets made, we've got our dies, ready to talk about how they come together in the striking process. So in the striking process, where we left off with planchets, the planchets travel from the upsetting mill to these big hoppers that are sitting right by the coin machines or the die presses. The planchets are gravity fed into these chutes. The chutes drop planchets into what we call feeder fingers. The feeder fingers slide back and forth like this across the piece of metal in the coining chamber. They slide across, and if you look at this picture, you can see that circle that's right there. That's where the new planchet, and it says blanks, so I should say planchets. The planchets are fed into that, and as it drops a new planchet into the chamber, it's pushing another coin out on the other end where that half circle is. So I'll show you this picture a little bit blown up in just a moment, but it says as the feeder fingers retract, the upper or hammer die comes down and the planchet is struck by both dies simultaneously as the collar, or what we call the retaining collar, or responsible for the third side of the coin, is employed. It's on springs. It's a spring-loaded collar. The lower or anvil die rises as the hammer die retracts. So here's a picture of it close up. Now, this is really tricky to understand. Again, I strongly urge you to please come out here to summer seminar when we're having summer seminar again. Dr. Wiles does a phenomenal job of explaining this process. And understand on your screen when you see the space between the die and the collar there, that is just for illustrative purposes. There's not that much space there. It's a really, really tight chamber. So you can tell in this picture that as the feeder finger is dropping a new planchet into that chamber, it's pushing the struck coin out and it goes out down into a chute. Here's when the feeder fingers go back. As the feeder fingers are retracting, that the dies have come together and struck that planchet that was in there. As that's happening, the feeder finger is going back to get another new planchet, should say planchet there, and the process just keeps on going very, very quickly. Now, they've changed a lot of the ways the machines do this. You can see on your screen right there, that is an old bliss press. And I want you to notice something on the side of that machine there in the picture on the left. You guys see all that grease that's there? That mint goop or grease winds up getting into a lot of places that they don't always plan. Some of you may have seen coins that look like they're missing certain parts of the design. A lot of times the culprit responsible for that is mint goop. So if you're wondering where does that stuff come from, it's all over. So if you look at the picture on your right, that is a bin of newly struck coins. And with these little bits, see, it goes into a smaller bin as the coins come off the press, and they get inspected. You can see on your on the right side there a picture of a mint employee inspecting coins as they're coming off the press. If they're good, and when he looks at a few of them as a sample, he'll pull a lever so that they can go on to the next part of the process for inspection. But if it looks like there's something wrong, maybe there's a huge die break or a die crack, hopefully he doesn't notice that. I mean, all of us error and variety collectors are, hoping these guys don't do their job that well, but unfortunately, they're pretty good at what they're doing. That's the reason why error coins are worth what they're worth. If you look at the picture on your left there, you'll see a bin of newly struck Jefferson nickels, and right dead center, I don't know if you guys can see that, but it looks like a huge cluster, a big error or something that unfortunately probably got melted down. And the lower right there looks like a broad strike. And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of those never wind up getting out. But if they do, the rejected coins wind up going on to a waffled machine. If you look in the bottom right picture there, those are a bunch of quarters that for some reason were deemed defective and wound up getting destroyed or waffled. They'll wind up going to recycling, or sometimes I think they wind up getting out of the mint. I have noticed some waffled coins for sale before. So after the coins are struck, here's a series of more riddlers. They always want to make sure they're doing their best for quality control. If there are too many problems with coins, they're afraid people may lose a bit of faith in the American economy. So it's always good that we have, good quality coins going out into circulation or into commercial channels. So you can see the Riddler screens are right here. Here's some close-ups of them. And if you look at the bottom left, I think I actually see a Jefferson nickel that's off center and wound up getting down to another Riddler screen. So that's another nice error that no one's going to get. But in the top right, you can see there are pictures of the 3 tiers of that Riddler screen. And the good coins in this process wind up going into a bin. So here's just a quick little pic I wanted to share with you of some error cents. Beautiful, beautiful error cents that will never get out of the mint and have probably long since been recycled, unfortunately. But so here's a photo of the approved coins being dropped into chutes. They get counted, packed into these huge ballistic bags, and then they are weighed. These ballistic bags wind up going into storage at the mint until they are shipped to a Fed bank for commercial distribution. The photo on your right, yeah, tons of coins in bags. You'd probably never guess that those were golden dollars. You make a lot of them, but they don't circulate very much unless you go to Ecuador. If you look at the photo on your right, the reason why I did that is because you can actually purchase a pallet of coins. A lot of the people who've been searching for the West Point quarters, if you're interested, if you've got $51,500 and the means to take physical delivery at either Philadelphia or Denver Mint, go for it. You might want to invest in security as well. I don't think a regular pickup or even a dually would be able to handle that. You're probably going to want to invest in something a little heavier. But at any rate, guys, we're going to move on to error coins right now. Now, of course, with errors, we're still going to talk about that PDS process, planchet, die, and strike. There are a lot more striking errors possible, but we'll get into planchet errors first. So, first of all, here's a photo again, side by side, of what a blank looks like and what a planchet looks like. Again, those of you who like to call them type 1 and type 2 blanks, go for it. That's fine. That's pretty accepted nomenclature in this hobby, but again, guys, blank and planchet to be technical. So, some things that can go wrong, and we're going to try doing this based on the steps of that process. So how the metals are alloyed, first of all. You can get improper alloy mixtures where the metals don't always completely melt in a homogeneous blend, where you're going to see streaks of some types of metals that didn't get completely melted down. You see this a lot around World War I era with a lot of Lincoln cents for some reason. I've noticed that. On the right side, beautiful error, affectionately referred to as a blowhole, or just a defective planchet, may be based on the way that the metal was poured. Pretty cool stuff. Sometimes gas bubbles or occlusions can happen, and you get all kinds of strange holes in coins like that. Other types of defective planchets, you can get certain cracks that, again, were a result of the metal or being alloyed or part of the rolling mill process. That 1970 Lincoln cent on the right, photo from Dr. Wiles. I'm not exactly sure what happened. I'm not sure if anyone is really sure what happened there, but it almost looks like could use it as a paper clip or some other device. Yeah, strange error. And a lot of times people, when they think about, how valuable should an error coin be? Usually when you talk about a wow factor, that's usually what contributes to value of error coins. So on the left side of your screen here, you can see what we call a cracked planchet. And it looks very similar to what we call a die crack. But die cracks are raised. They're above the surface. A cracked planchet is actually going to be incuse, or it'll be sunk in, and it's actually a crack within the metal. On the right, you can see a picture of a broken planchet, and that's just a result of maybe the metal being too brittle. The coin may not have been annealed properly. Maybe it wasn't annealed at all, and that's why it was just too brittle when it went through the striking process. If you could find the other part of that dime that's missing, that would be impressive, and then you would have what we call a mated pair. Very, very cool when you can find two pieces of a error coin puzzle like that. So understand with our modern dimes and above denominations that are made of copper nickel, we didn't have a chance to really get into when they're rolling sheets of this clad strip. You have to understand that it's almost like a sandwich, or it's like 3 layers. You have a pure copper layer in the middle of 2 sheets of copper nickel. They are fused together under intense pressure in the rolling mill. And sometimes those layers don't always fuse together as properly as they should. And as a result, you could wind up missing portions of layers on a coin, or in the case with these two that you see on the screen here, they're missing the entire top layer. Or I mean, we could say top layer for sake of argument, because that would be the obverse. So what you're seeing right here on screen, they're actually copper or brown, almost looks like a brand new cent. If you want to say penny, that's fine too. I won't hold that against you, but we say cent here. So it'll look copper on the obverse, and if you flip it over, it should look just like the regular copper nickel reverse. So sometimes you'll get with the new Zinkins or zinc planchets for Lincoln cents, sometimes they aren't completely plated. Again, understand since 1982, we've been using blanks or planchets rather from an outside firm or a couple of different outside firms. Ball, people who make mason jars, for example, is a big one. Sometimes they don't always have the copper plating on there. Now, this can be a little bit confusing sometimes when you might find something in your change. We get phone calls a lot of times when people might find a cent like this that's completely white or silver colored, and we have to tell people a lot of times it's not really an error, it's something that happened in a high school science class. A lot of times, for some reason, Lincoln cents are popular victims in chemistry classes, but you know, so be it. You know, it's they're still serving a purpose, so we still need to make the 1 cent coin for science teachers. So here is a interesting error that's called a tapered planchet. Understand, when we saw the pictures of the rolling mill early on, sometimes, I mean, those metal rollers are supposed to be completely even, but sometimes one side might be higher than another. And as a result of that, you're going to get planchets struck from that strip of metal, or blanks, and that would be turned into planchets. You'll get those blanks that might be a little bit higher on one end than another. So it's easier to detect an error like this when a coin is uncirculated. Once it's been circulated, it's a little bit trickier, but you might look at a coin sometimes and think, man, it's really worn on this side, on this part of the obverse, but not that part of the obverse. Reason for that could be it was struck on a tapered planchet, or it could have been something in the striking process where the dies didn't line up evenly. One of them might have been a little bit off. So that might be a cause for why you would see stronger details on one part of obverse or reverse than on another. So here's a picture of that punched webbing. So you can see where the bow ties are cut up. That's where they come from. But sometimes that gang punch that they have at the mint might punch over holes that have already been punched. So that's how we wind up getting clipped planchet errors. When you see coins, when they're struck and they don't actually have 100% round, that would be one of the biggest reasons why. It's something that happened in the planchet making process. So here are pictures that you can tell. Here's a curved clip on a blank, not a planchet, and you can tell because there's no upset rim. On the right, this is a picture of a quarter that has been struck on a curved clip planchet. Now, a lot of times people will refer to, or well, they'll ask, well, how do you determine if it's a real clipped planchet, not just something that someone altered? One of the best ways to do this is look at exactly 180 degrees, the opposite side of that clip. So the clip on this quarter happened at, say, for argument's sake, the 1 o'clock or the 2 o'clock position. Look exactly across at like the 8 o'clock position. You'll notice the rim looks slightly different. It's kind of a little wider, a little bit flatter. An error variety expert by the last name of Blakesley was the first person to really point this out. So a lot of EV collectors refer to that as the Blakesley effect. It is not always present, but a lot of times it really is, especially with a curved clip. So you'll notice on some of the other clipped planchet errors we're going to look at here in just a minute, look for that Blakesley effect if you're not sure if it's genuine or not. Of course, when you see a double clip like this, it kind of eliminates that effect, so you couldn't really look for it. But chances are that is a genuine clip. You also want to look at how the letters or other devices look as they meet the edge of that clip. If you see metal that's kind of like pushed up, then that's an indication of a fake error. The metal really should just kind of like just fall right off. It just should be a nice clean 90-degree angle. On the right-hand side there, you can see an example of a triple clip planchet, pretty cool coin. On the left side of your screen there, you can see an example of a straight clip error. So that was probably from the end of a sheet of metal. Because you might be thinking, well, that could have happened in a blanking press. Nope, you're correct. It was maybe at the end of a sheet of metal. Slight Blakesley effect going on there at about the 4 or 5 o'clock position. And then if you look at that beautiful Kennedy half error, 1964, luckily it got struck that we can still tell the date. But you could always do a metal analysis to figure out the year too for Kennedy halves. Luckily, there's only one 90%er for circulation back then. A ragged clip might happen because that was at the end of a sheet of metal as well. And this one, you can notice a huge Blakesley effect going on there at about the 1 or 2 o'clock position with that rim flattening. A nice example of a crescent clip coin. Sometimes in the blanking press, the punch might not go all the way through the metal. As a result, you'll get what is an incomplete punch. So that's what that semicircle is there on that 1970D Lincoln cent that you see on the right side of your screen. Didn't go all the way through. And that could be easily faked, but what you would want to look for is where that metal goes in. You want to look to see if there's any metal coming out, kind of like if you threw a pebble into a pond, you'd have water being displaced. You kind of want to look for that effect of the metal all along that edge there. So I can come over to the next picture here. Really dramatic errors, what we call laminations or laminated planchets. That Lincoln cent, part of the metal kind of flaked away, and this could happen as part of the alloying process. The metals weren't homogeneously alloyed. As a result, after they're struck, parts of it might fall away. Really cool error on the right side there. And again, the more dramatic an error, usually the more valuable it could be considered. And it's already on a 20-cent piece or two. This is a type of lamination, very drastic, usually referred to as a clamshell, because it kind of like opens up the way a clam might. Just a bit of advice, don't help it open up all the way. Don't separate that. Having it with that look, very dramatic, very, very cool. So this is what happens when some of those bow ties or little fragments that should have been refused or rejected in the riddling screen process. Unfortunately, sometimes things make their way that weren't planned, and they wind up getting struck. So pretty dramatic errors you see right there on the left and in the center there that were bow ties. And then you see just a tiny fragment of metal that you can actually tell was part of a $50. It actually went through the press. So pretty cool. Very dramatic little scrap of a Lincoln cent right there. Well, we know it's a memorial cent, so between 59 and 2008, chances are it's copper, so probably between 1959 and 1982. Very, very dramatic. May not be very huge, but sure most of us wouldn't turn that down in our collections. So now need to discuss errors that can happen as a result of the die making process. So first of all, you could have a situation where when the dies come together, there's no blank in between. As a result, the dies are going to come together under intense pressure, and you're going to get some image transfer from one die to the other and vice versa. So if you look at the picture on your left, you can see that's right in front of Roosevelt's face there, and you can see elements from the reverse of a dime from E pluribus unum and some of the leaves there. If you look at the photo on your right, you can see part of the reverse of a Lincoln Memorial cent from a die clash. We used to call those prisoner pennies, but those you can only find dated 2008 or earlier, to 1959 to 2008. On your screen now, you can see a picture of a very famous die error. A lot of us refer to it as a die variety. We'll get into that a little bit later. Some of you may be familiar with what they call the Bugs Bunny $50 in the Franklin series. Bit of advice, don't just look for them in 1955. That was just the most hyped up year. You can find them on many other years, and it's a little trickier with some others. But the reason why this happens, if you look to the picture on your right, you can see what we call overlays. And this is something that a lot of error and variety people need to do when you're trying to understand how certain elements will clash and where they would show up on a struck coin. So when you look at that picture of the $50 there, and I know they call them a Bugs Bunny, sometimes people almost think it looks like vampire teeth, like fangs instead of Bugs Bunny. But the reason why that happens is because if you look at the picture on your right, you can see how the tips of the eagle's right wing, the feather tips, kind of line up with Ben Franklin's lips and the nose area right there. So that part of the clash wasn't all polished away. Mint employees, when they notice a die or dies that have been clashed, they'll try and stop the press and try and polish away what they can of those errant marks. And if you look very carefully at the picture, that close-up of the Franklin half there, right by the teeth, you can see all kinds of little fine die scratches. Those are raised. Those are above the surface of the coin. They're on the die, so if the die is scratched, that's going to be incuse on the die, which means it'll be raised on the struck coins. So that is not damage. That won't be held against you as far as the grade of the coin. And if you notice carefully, it almost looks like part of the cheek was worn away there too. Sometimes the mint employees get a little overzealous in their die polishing efforts. Some of you, if you're familiar with the 1922 Lincoln cents that were made in Denver, they didn't make them any in Philadelphia that year, but there are some that are missing mint marks. Same happened at that same mint back in 1937 with a nickel. So die cracks. Now, the mint, they do everything they can to make sure that the dies are tempered as well as they can, that they're going to last in production for as long as possible. But they do develop cracks as time goes on, even the ones that are tempered and hardened as well as they should be to specifications. So usually these cracks will appear from the rim going into the center of the coin. If you look at the photo on your right, that's a really good close-up of a die crack coming off the rim into toward the center, toward Roosevelt's face. You can also see a tiny little die crack just starting where the B in Liberty is. And technically, I remember Dr. Weil saying that a shattered die it has to have at least 3 die cracks in order to be considered shattered. So some other errors, if you look, you'll see what we call die chips and die breaks. Those of you that like to look at really tiny little parts, those of you that are really good at noticing, small little things, like the way I misspelled the word errors, for example. That was by design. I know how to spell. You might notice sometimes tiny little chips of metal that form in parts of the date or in parts of the word liberty. They are technically errors. Just don't plan on retiring off of them. They're not very significant. They're rather common. But, if someone wants to specialize in, little things like that, remember, it's a hobby. It's not about, the profit motive necessarily. Collect what you like and how you like. So really cool errors right here, what we call cuds or die breaks that occur at the rim. And that's usually where you get most of your die breaks, where a chunk of the actual die will just completely fall off. The EV coin collectors over the years have affectionately called these cuds because it kind of resembles the shape of, well, it's really nondescript. It's kind of like if a cow was just chewing on their cud and just kind of spit it out, and that's pretty much what we think it might look like. So you have to understand, with an error like this, metal is going, in the striking process, metal is just going to flow into the point of least resistance. So it's going to move to that path of least resistance. So it's going to fill in that area where that die break is. But because of that, on the opposite side of the coin, you'll notice a little bit of a void or missing elements, because something had to give. I mean, if the metal is flowing into that huge crevice or that huge place where there's no design, the metal's going to fill that in, and as a result, anything behind that or on the other side is going to be missing. So that's a good way to help authenticate those types of errors as well. I want this coin very, very badly. Beautiful example of a cud. Awesome. I mean, when you look at the right side of the obverse, you can see a huge piece of the die face had fallen off. So glad this found its way out of the mint. And to help authenticate it, if you look at the picture on the right, you can tell there is a lot of missing design that should have been there, but because the metal had to flow into that die break area, it couldn't strike up completely on the reverse. Now, these are considered die errors as well. Some of you may remember the 2004 Denver, Wisconsin extra leaf varieties or die errors. They were gouges that happened somehow. We're not really sure exactly how. These coins, a lot of them wound up being discovered around Tucson, Arizona area. One very prominent collector of Indian and Flying Eagle cents was the guy who noticed these, Rick something or other, Rick Snow. But you might notice on the left what they call the low leaf variety, and then on the right the high leaf variety. They are collected by people as such, and there's a premium for them. They've fallen out of popular favor in recent years, and understandably so, because there was a lot of hype when they first came out. But like anything that's hyped up in this hobby, there are trends, and not as valuable, but still definitely worth looking for if you're searching through quarters. Whether or not they're real errors or not, some people suspect a mint employee may have helped that. We may never know. So remember, I showed you the picture of all that mint goop earlier? There's a lot of it there. If you look at the picture of this Eisenhower dollar, it does look like it is circulated, but even before it was circulated, you can tell it's missing some design elements. And that would be attributed to what we call filled dies or a struck through grease error. Either term is fine. It'll work either way. Struck through grease or a filled die. Just it would not allow the design to completely strike up. So sometimes that mint goop gets a little bit hardened, and before too long in the process, it will fall out. And if it falls out, it usually will land on a planchet and be incused or punched in. And it's usually an element that's near or pretty close to the element that it was filling in previously. So if you look at the quarter on your left, you'll see it actually has the regular D mint mark. And the D that you see there underneath the S in trust, it doesn't really match the same shape as the D mint mark. My guess is that the D in the word God got filled in, and then that fell out at some point and got struck into the coin. Of course, it's no longer there. It's not retained. That goop fell out, unfortunately, but it did leave a mark on the coin, that the next coin it struck after that fell out. There's on the right-hand side, you can see, I believe that's a Mexican peso from 1971, and you can see that there was a 9 that fell out next to that. Really cool looking error. So the dies, they only have a certain amount of life that they can use to strike coins. If you have a copy of the Cherry Picker's Guide, the 5th edition, volume 2, there is a graph in there where they talk about how long dies last in coin production. Technically, a Lincoln cent, and this is an average. Again, it could be more or less depending on the actual strength of the dies being used, the working dies striking the coins, that is. For example, Lincoln cent, you can get out about 1.4 million strikes out of the dies. Jefferson nickel, the old Monticello design, on average about 200,000 strikes. Roosevelt dimes, about 300,000 strikes. They say that Philadelphia can get about 230,000 strikes off a pair of dies, but Denver would get 400,000. So Philly, 230,000, Denver, 400,000 for a pair of dies. Washington quarters, about 752,000 strikes before the dies would have to be retired. Statehood quarters, about 275,000 strikes, which seems odd to me because statehood quarters are in lower relief. So that may have changed now, especially now with the America the Beautiful series. I don't know if it's me or not, but do you notice that the relief just keeps getting lower and lower and lower on our quarters? Kennedy halves, about 160,000 strikes for the die pairs. Sacagawea dollars, about 250,000, and about the same or less for the presidential dollars. Proof dies, however, only last for about 4,000 strikes, or technically about 2,000 coins. If you weren't already aware of it, proof coins actually receive no less than 2 blows from the dies to truly bring up the full design. So they don't last nearly as long. So when you find errors or varieties on proof coins, they're a lot more significant, I would think, than just circulation quality coins. So striking errors. This is going to take a little bit longer to go through because where the rubber meets the road, where dies and planchets come together, there can be all kinds of problems that happen. So let's get into that. So first of all, and we'll try and take this, from the least drastic to the most drastic. Sometimes the dies do not always line up. Remember we said the lower die is usually called the anvil die, and that pretty much stays still. I mean, it does move. It's based on a cam. But the hammer or the upper die is usually the one responsible for coming up and down in that process. The terminology is based on the old minting processes used in ancient times where you would have to actually take a die in your hand and hammer it while there was one being held in a big wood block or an anvil. So sometimes the dies are supposed to come straight together, but sometimes the hammer die does not exactly line up. So as a result, it looks like an off-center strike on just one side of the coin. So if you're seeing what looks like an off-center struck coin, but just on one side, that was due to the dies being misaligned. And they're usually not considered valuable at all unless they're dramatic. With any error, that's pretty much the case. This dime right here, that's pretty dramatic misaligned dies. On this Lincoln cent from 2000 from the Denver Mint, very misaligned dies. Really sad what happened to this coin too. I mean, you might notice there's all these gouges all over it, and that is damage that did not happen at the mint. Chances are that poor Lincoln cent there was a beautiful, problem-free error that probably got caught in a counting machine at a bank or other financial institution. And unfortunately, the employees there, most of them are not coin collectors. They just think, man, I need to get through this, get this problem out of the way. So I'll probably just take a screwdriver or any other sharp thing to just pry that thing out of there. And you could tell it took them a couple digs to get that out. But once they finally did, left a beautiful error coin damaged. But anyway, this is a genuine off-center struck Kennedy half dollar. You can tell both sides were not aligned, it wasn't a result of the dies not being aligned. It was a result of the planchet not being 100% centered over the dies in that striking process. Some of us coin nerds are a little nerdlier than others and have put together what we call off-center clocks. I remember the first one of these I ever saw was when I was a kid, just starting off in the 80s as a collector. And a collector had or a dealer actually showed me he had an off-center clock of bison nickels or buffalo nickels. Really interesting if you could put a set like this together. So, very dramatic to make an off-center clock like that. Bit trickier of a striking error is what we call a brockage. Now, this is when a planchet goes into the chamber, dies come together, coin gets struck, but instead of being ejected from the coining chamber, that newly struck coin sticks to that hammer die. As that hammer die goes back up and a new planchet gets fed into the process, that stuck coin is going to function as the new obverse die for the next planchet that gets fed in. So that's what this coin is, the next, or one of the next coins that got fed in by and was struck by one of a brockaged die. So you'll have that normal reverse that you can see on your left, but then on the right, that's what should have been the obverse. But unfortunately, there was a coin stuck to it, so it couldn't strike the obverse. It just struck what was stuck to it, which would be a negative image of the reverse die, or of the reverse from an already struck coin. It's pretty tricky to really understand, especially because I can't show you in person. You know, some of these things I can't point to things, and that's really bad for a guy who's part Italian to try and not use his hands while giving a presentation. So you can see a beautiful example of a golden dollar, or a gold dollar, not golden dollar, from 1874. Gold is such a soft metal, so the design elements transferred wonderfully in this particular brockage. Very cool coin that looks like it was probably graded by NGC based on the prongs that you see there. So some other dramatic striking errors. Other things can get caught into the press. Sometimes it's not always just the planchet that makes its way in there. So for example, that nickel that you see in the top left, it looks like something got trapped in between the obverse die and the planchet. The reverse die struck just fine. You'd almost think that it would have struck up with a more full steps. If there was something else in the press, you'd have thought it would have actually made it a little bit stronger strike, but that wasn't the case. And that may have been struck through cloth or maybe a sanding disc. Remember, they have to file away clash marks, so a lot of times they'll use sandpaper discs to polish away a lot of those mistakes or errors. So sometimes those discs wind up getting left behind or find their way into the press somehow. On the right, very dramatic error, that 1966 Lincoln sent, where it almost looks like a staple. And I have erroneously called that a staple before, but that is actually a wire bristle from a brush. They've used that sometimes too to remove the hardened mint goop from dies. They have to use wire bristle brushes to get in there. And sometimes a bristle falls out and lands on a planchet in the striking chamber. At the lower left, you can see an example of a pretty dramatic struck through grease or filled dies. And you can tell it's not just wear, because if you look at the reverse, you can tell it's got a pretty strong, I would say, AU details, or almost completely uncirculated details. But that obverse definitely struck through something. Grease, most likely. That Kennedy half at the bottom right, pretty cool example of a struck through string error. How that string got in there? Anyone's guess. So when you talk about multiple strikes, a lot of times people try to fake these, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But a genuine double or triple or any multiple struck coin is going to have elements that are in positive or relief, just the way a regular struck coin should be. So you see at the top, a 1982 Lincoln cent. First strike that it received was perfectly normal, but unfortunately it just didn't get ejected from the chamber in time before the dies came together again. Very dramatic triple struck Indian head cent down there. Really glad it got, well, you can tell it had a normal strike, and then it received two other partial strikes before it finally got ejected from the chamber. Very nice that it does have a date on there. That definitely helps understand things. Now, some other dramatic striking errors. On the top left there, I remember reading about this in Coin World magazine not too long ago, a 1952 Denver Lincoln cent that probably got a normal strike, and then instead of being ejected from the chamber, kind of got rotated in the chamber instead and wound up getting another strike on top of that. So any of the elements that were there from the first strike, some of them got flattened or even distorted. Looking at Lincoln's face there, it's pretty dramatic. Those elements got distorted by that second strike. And it almost looks like it got a third little bit of a strike there. It was almost completely free of the chamber, but got just nicked right there on the edge. Pretty interesting error at the top, the 1998 off-center Lincoln cent that also got a second strike, so a multiple error. Then at the top right, you see a Lincoln cent that was struck off center and then got a second strike that was flipped over. So it looks like that coin, as it was maybe trying to leave the chamber, just wound up getting flipped over, and before it could actually leave, wound up getting that secondary flip over strike. At the bottom left, it's what some of us might call a Mickey Mouse error. So to all my collectors in Florida, the way that happens is you have to understand sometimes in the old bliss presses that they would use, you would have a dual or a quad head where they'd use 2 or 4 dies all at the same time coming down. So if a planchet's not fed correctly, it could wind up getting a couple partial strikes from 2 of the die heads or 2 of the dies that are in there. Nowadays, though, I don't know if we addressed this earlier, the dies or the coins are actually struck more in a horizontal orientation instead of vertical, using the Schuler or Gravener presses. At the bottom center right there, pretty interesting coin. It's a double struck but with an indent. Another planchet got fed in while the struck coin was in there. Partial strike. Really tricky to understand without being able to show you those coins in person. Again, just another plea about how important it is for you to come out to summer seminar and take the class in person with Dr. Wiles. Then on the right, a very dramatic 1972 Denver Kennedy half that got 2 strikes as well. So remember we mentioned earlier the collar die responsible for retaining the shape of the coin. Well, if the collar isn't employed in the striking process, you just have the obverse and reverse dies coming together, and the planchet is going to just kind of squish out like a pancake. So that's why these coins have that dramatic look to them. There was no retaining collar that was used in the striking of those particular coins. Pretty cool. Not the most expensive errors, but pretty dramatic. Now, speaking of dramatic and valuable errors, and this kind of goes along with brockage errors. Remember we said before how sometimes a struck coin can get stuck to a die? Well, sometimes that stuck coin is used to strike a lot of other coins before it falls off or is removed. As a result, that stuck coin with successive strikes, the metal is going to kind of stretch up and around over the die neck. As it just keeps striking and striking, the metal is going to just keep stretching up further and further to the point where you get something that resembles a bottle cap, what we call a die cap. Very, very cool. So any coins that were struck by that die cap would have a regular reverse, but an obverse that looks like, stay with me now, it's going to be enlarged, distorted, and incused, and backward, a mirror image of what the reverse design should look like. Very tricky to understand, but again, come out for summer seminar and we'll explain more. So wrong metal or wrong denomination errors. A lot of times the wrong size planchet will get fed into a press intentionally or unintentionally. As is the case maybe in the 1970s. There were a lot of things that happened at the mints in the 70s with errors, but that's a story for a whole nother time. So pretty dramatic errors, nevertheless, when you see a wrong metal or wrong denomination. Pretty cool sometimes when you see Indian head cents struck on $2.50 gold blanks. I know one person that's probably with us today, I think, may own at least one of those very valuable errors. So sometimes you get what we call multiple errors, or, you know, where there's more than one mistake at hand there. Both of these coins are planchet and strike errors. There was nothing wrong with the dies that struck them. Just it was a wrong, something was wrong with the planchet. At the top, it was a Lincoln cent planchet that got fed into the die press while Jefferson nickel dies were in there. But you can tell that even that coin wound up getting flipped over and double struck. Very dramatic error. At the bottom, we have what you'd call an 11-cent piece. It was a dime that was regular, normal struck dime that found its way into the press when cent dies were in there. So that is a super dramatic error where you have a struck dime being used as the planchet to make a cent. Very, very cool. And of course, with quality control, riddlers are not going to catch that. So, because it's still the exact same shape as the intended denomination. So look very carefully for those. Good luck. So some very dramatic errors that you may see. At the top left, we have a Lincoln cent that was struck over a Panamanian centesimo. You might ask yourself, how the heck could that happen? Well, the U.S. Mint was responsible for striking coins for other countries at certain times. That practice has ended in recent years, but we used to make coins for other countries. So that was a struck Panamanian cent or centesimo that wound up finding its way into U.S. Cent dies. Pretty cool. The one in the middle, at the top middle there that you see, a 1981, that's what we call a fold-over error. Really cool. And for something like that to happen, it's almost as if the planchet has to enter the coining chamber vertically. And as the dies come down on it, it almost like folds it and then strikes it. Very dramatic error. On the top right, that's an example of what we call a saddle strike. And it's pretty much what you would see remember when we said you could see a dual or quad head die press, where a planchet kind of fell in between two dies and it wound up getting struck like that, so it kind of resembles a saddle shape. The 1964 Lincoln cent at the bottom is also a saddle strike, but it was on a struck coin that happened to. So it was a coin that did not make it out of the press. Same with the 1964 cent that you see at the bottom middle, but it also got another strike too. So it's technically like a quadruple strike error. Amazing coin. And then that 1980 Lincoln cent in the bottom right, the second strike it received, it had another planchet laying on top of it. So that planchet wound up getting struck, but that part of the cent did not. Those were struck simultaneously. So if you could find that other mate to that, that would be very impressive. And as far as value is concerned, it would definitely increase the value of having both coins together, what we would call a mated pair, like you see on the chain strike or the dime at the bottom middle of your screen right now. The top left is a picture of an Eisenhower dollar that before getting struck actually had a dime planchet on top of it. you have to ask yourself how something like that could actually happen legitimately at the mint. And we'll have to leave it at that for now. But come to summer seminar and we'll tell you how things like that may have happened on the midnight shift at the mint in the 70s and how things like that may have gotten out in forklifts. So if you look at the nickel in the middle there, the top middle, that is struck by a split die, or one that really dramatically broke. The Lincoln cent that you see in the top right, that's what we call a partial brockage, or where another planchet was laying on top of it when it was in the chamber being struck. Same with the bottom right, but actually, I apologize. The top right and bottom left, those were actually brockage by already struck cent, as you can tell by the distorted elements that are on there, especially that Lincoln cent at the bottom. You can see parts of the memorial design that are really distorted because of how it was struck. It's really tricky to get into the whole process of how brockages can really occur without being able to have more time. We could really take a lot of time if we had it to discuss that. But you call in the bottom middle there, those dimes, that's what we call a chain strike. You can tell it's like 4 different strikes all together there, but 2 separate coins. And you might notice where they meet when they receive that strike at the same time, when they're both in the chamber together, they're going to meet at a straight line like that. Pretty cool how that happens. And again, it's just because metal follows the path of least resistance in the striking process. That Eisenhower dollar you see in the bottom right there, that is a beautiful example of what happens when a feeder finger doesn't get out of the way completely in the striking process. So as a result, part of a feeder finger got struck into the obverse of that Ike dollar. Very dramatic error indeed. Now, sometimes you get what we call bonded errors, where planchet gets fed in and it doesn't get ejected. That could just keep on happening over and over to the point where you get these huge clusters that develop. Very dramatic. Very difficult to leave the mint also. Have to wonder how some of these things may have gotten out, but again, story for another time. Really cool error that you see right here. And again, I think one of the members with us today is actually the owner of this piece, or at one point was owner of this item. I believe it's what is referred to as a pine cone, because you can see how it's just a bonded error. It's just planchet just keep getting fed in and just getting struck. And under the intense pressure, you have to understand the mint might use about like 50 tons of pressure to strike a coin. So that's a lot of pressure, and a lot of heat is created in that process as well. So it's going to fuse them together over time. So you can just tell many planchets were fed in there. You can probably count them if you had this in your possession, but very dramatic error for sure. Now, this coin that you see on your screen made headlines in recent years, and honestly, I'm not sure if it's an error coin or not. This is something that started off as a 1941 Canadian quarter. It found its way into the striking chamber at the San Francisco Mint in 1970. Based on the way proof planchets are prepared and the quality controls for proof coins, you really have to ask yourself, did this thing have some help? Was there anyone responsible for this error coin at the mint? Technically, I guess it is an error. It made it out. It was found in a proof set. I believe it sold for over $50,000. Very dramatic, but is it really an error coin if there was intent to create it? We could argue that forever, I'm sure. So a couple of other things that might not really be classified as errors. At the top left there, you see one of my favorite die variety coins, 1944 D Walk-in Liberty half dollar, or Liberty Walk-in half dollar. Pardon me. They noticed on one of the working dies they were missing the designer's initials. So the mint employee decided to do his best work at engraving those initials on the working die itself. Didn't do too bad of a job of putting Adolf Wyman's initials on the $50 there. In the middle of the top there, you see a 1955 poor man's double die. Please understand, that is not an error coin. I repeat, not an error. Poor man's double die coins are a result of die fatigue, where the die is just used too much in production to the point where you get some distorted elements. Earlier, I showed a picture of a statehood quarter that had a nice, beautiful obverse, but the reverse was just mushy because it should have been retired. It was in service for too long. Now, the Lincoln cent you see from 1922 and the Buffalo nickel from 1937 from the Denver Mint, both of those are repeated. They weren't just one-offs. It was a problem with the die where probably a result of die clashes where design elements were just polished away. They did not make Lincoln cents at the Philadelphia Mint in 1922. So that was a coin that was struck in Denver, but an overzealous mint employee polished away clash marks and along with it, polished away the mint mark. There are a couple of different varieties in 1922. You have what they call a weak D as well, where it was polished away, but not completely. Those are worth a little bit of money as well, but the one that's completely missing the D, I believe that's die pair number 2, very good coin. To the point where collectors of Lincoln cents actually consider it a part of the regular series because it's such a popular variety. And the same can be said of the 37D Buffalo nickel, the three-legged variety, where you can see design elements were polished away, namely the poor bison's front leg there. The coin that you see in the bottom right there, that golden dollar, that was actually from the year 2000, where unfortunately they did not use an obverse of a Sacagawea dollar, but instead it was a statehood quarter obverse that got into the press instead. Some people might refer to that as a $1.25 coin or an 8th eagle. So pretty dramatic. That would be considered an error, and that is a very dramatic one. Those go for big money anytime one is up for sale, and I'm not sure who it is, but I think there's one collector out there who's really trying to corner the market on those. Anytime one is offered for sale, buys it and pays very strong for them. So look for those and then find that buyer. So that pretty much takes us through the coin making process and coin errors. For the next half hour that we have left, we're going to go over what we call die varieties, and we're trying to get into cherry picking a little bit. Again, remember, if you're trying to come up with a black and white difference between what an error and a die variety is, it's not going to happen. There is some overlap. It's not always very clean and easy to make that determination. Again, errors are technically considered one-offs, not really intentional. Varieties are usually problems that are on the die and they are repeated. So cherry picking. Now, a lot of people, when they think of cherry picking, they think, oh, that's going out and sitting at dealers' tables and not spending money, just looking through a bunch of things to find maybe one really wrong coin. That's one form of cherry picking. You could be looking for these more elusive die varieties or unattributed or misattributed errors. I can't tell you how many times I'll look in dealer stocks and they might say some coin is an error, and I'm thinking, no, that's just damage. But again, we all operate at different levels of education in this hobby, which is why we always say buy the book before you buy the coin. So cherry picking can also be hunting for undervalued treasures in dealer junk boxes. I actually teach a class about that topic during summer seminar when we have our live summer seminars going on. Cherry picking is also a lot of expert dealers. You might see them on the show on the floor at a coin show, and their form of cherry picking is very involved. where they are looking at undergraded coins to try, or coins that are in grades or slabs that might not be the accurate grade on them. If they think it's nicer than that grade, yeah, then they may buy that and then try and get it regraded. Sometimes the difference between one grade point can mean thousands of dollars. So moving right along, some of the things that are known as die varieties. For example, you might have competing designs or different style design elements within the same year. Popular ones in 1960, the small date sense, it happened in Philadelphia and Denver, but the Philadelphia variety made a lot of waves in the hobby back in the 60s, to the point where people were spending a lot of money on rolls of them. I mean, they were going for quite a bit of money. Not so much the case anymore. It happened in 1970 with Lincoln Cents. In San Francisco, you have the large and small dates there. In 1982 in Philadelphia and Denver with Lincoln Cents, you have different size dates. And it's always easier if you have both of them side by side like this to tell the difference. You may have modified designs where sometimes they'll use dies that have slightly different elements. They may have been strengthened or just made slightly different for a regular circulation strike or a proof strike. And sometimes dies for one get used in the other. So you might find, for example, Lincoln Cents from 1998, 99, and 2000. Some of them may have what they call the WAM or wide AM reverse. Those are a little bit harder to find, especially for 1999. But if you look at your coins carefully, you might notice these on regular circulation quality Lincoln Cents from those years. With Washington quarters, I believe from 1956 to 1964, there were some Philadelphia quarters that had reverse dies where they were struck, or they were used to strike the reverse. Pretty common on some years, but some of the years between 56 and 62 or 64 are pretty difficult. Then you see what they call the type C reverse, which is found first on quarters from 1965, but there was one of them that actually got used at Denver in 1964. So check your 1964 D quarters for that reverse. It's a pretty, it's worth finding if you can. Remember we said before 1909 that we would have repunched dates or RPDs, because on the dies, usually with working dies or working hubs, they would actually punch those dates into those dies. And sometimes they may make more for 1 year and they may have them left over, but in order to save costs, they'll try and recycle dies or try and reuse them. So you might notice where they would kind of try and remove the last digit and then just punch over it with the digit for the year that they need to make. On the right-hand side there, that is actually an 1817/4. It's a 17/14 capped bust half dollar. That is one of the best Overton varieties in the series. Very, very dramatic repunch date. I blew it up that big so you can really see most of the 4 is still there faintly, but pretty strong overdate. Remember, so if that ended in 1909, a 1942 Mercury dime with the 42 over the 1 is not a real repunch date. It's a result of the hubbing process. It is technically a double die obverse coin for the Philadelphia and Denver 42 over 41s. So other varieties you have when we're still punching those dates in before 1909, you have misplaced dates or MPDs. Sometimes it was just a die sinker trying to do a trial, to see how hard the die steel was before they put it in the real place. So you might notice in the denticles below the date, parts of the one of the elements or one of the usually the last digit sticking slightly up above or hiding in the denticles there. So on that 1865 3-cent piece, you can see the top of a 5 there, in between the 6 and the 5 where the denticles are. And that 1876, I believe that is a half dollar, seated half. There's the top of a 6 and the denticles hiding underneath where the 7 is. It's a little trickier to see. And then really interesting Morgan dollar die variety from 1892 from the New Orleans Mint. There are some who've argued it's just a die gouge, but it really resembles the bottom shape of a 9. If it is indeed a true misplaced date, that's probably the most dramatic one in the entire Morgan dollar series. And usually the misplaced dates with Morgan dollars would be hiding in the denticles, but this one is kind of up in the V where the hair is. Very cool variety. And again, we would say that that's a die variety, not an error, because it's repeated. Many of them are going to be made almost exactly from that die or from that pair of dies. Sometimes you may get different size mint marks. And that happens sometimes in the older days of the mint because they may have been using a punch that was intended for a different denomination. I'll show you a photo in just a minute of another coin that'll have something like that. But you can see in 1928, different size mint marks on Lincoln cents, the small and the large. The large mint marks are harder to find for 1928. And that's pretty much on all denominations, not just Lincoln cents. The same can be said in 1941 with the small s and large s. You see that on not just nickels, but other coins as well. There are different styles of mint marks. For example, the mercury dime that you see at the bottom there, they have different style mint marks. Some of them are more scarce to find than others. For example, in 1945 in San Francisco, some of you may be familiar with the micro S. That may have been intended for a Lincoln cent, but then again, dime is smaller than a Lincoln cent. Not really sure what happened. So in 1979 and 81 on your proof coins, you may be familiar with what we call type 1 and type 2 mint marks. It's really easy to tell the difference in 1979 between the type 1 and type 2. In 1981, it gets a little trickier. One hint I can give you to also tell the difference between the 1981 S mint marks, not only is it flatter on top for the type 2, but the type 2 mint mark is also frosted. So when you're looking at a proof, Susan, or actually any of the proof coins from a 1981 proof set, look at that mint mark too to see if it's also frosted the way the other letters and devices are. So you can get what is called a repunched mint mark. Understand, like we said before, the mint marks were punched individually into each working die. That's why you will get sometimes, there are some years, for example, like 1960 Lincoln cents, where you have well over 100 different repunched mint marks. A lot of them are very similar and very difficult to tell one from another. But a lot of times it could be a result of, let's say, a die sinker punching it in and maybe didn't like where it was placed, or they're just trying to bring the design up completely and accidentally tilted it just a little bit one way or the other, or held it differently. And as a result, it created a doubling or an extra punch of a mint mark there. Some of them are more dramatic than others. Understand that if it's really tiny and they're just real small notches, it's not going to make that big of a deal. Barely noticeable differences produce barely noticeable profits. So it's got to be much more dramatic in order to really garner any interest. You can see right here at the bottom a couple of examples of Kennedy half dollars with repunched mint marks on the 1964 Denvers. All three of those are considered better die varieties. You can tell they have what we call FS numbers, or FIVA Stanton numbers. Bill FIVA and JT Stanton. This would be a horrible presentation to do if I didn't mention their names. Unfortunately, JT's no longer with us, but Bill still is. They were the guys who put together really groundbreaking work on die varieties and compiled them for all the rest of us to go out and hunt for. Thanks for that, guys. So yeah, and the Cherry Picker's Guide, they're all the varieties have what is called a FIBA Stanton catalog numbers. That's what FS refers to there. Sometimes you have over mint marks. Now, this is a result of a mint needing a die, but unfortunately it already had a mint mark on it intended for another mint. So a lot of times the Philadelphia Mint was responsible for doing this more often than not. They would get a die, let's say from Denver, and they're thinking, well, we need to repurpose this for San Francisco. So they would try to efface that Denver mint mark and then just punch a San Francisco an S over that and send it off to San Francisco. But you can tell it doesn't always work. It's not always clean like that. So sometimes parts of the other under mint mark that was already there, the previous one, will still show. A lot of times this would happen too when there were severe shortages. Let's say maybe at the Denver Mint, they needed coins and the closest way to get them was from San Francisco. So they might contact San Francisco to try and get a die, and then they would try doing this as well. So that's why we get a lot of those over mint marks. You can tell in the middle there is actually a picture of an 1882 Morgan dollar, O over S variety. Very cool. Washington quarter on the right there, S over D. So moving right along, of course, you can see some other ones where you have over mint marks, where it's still over the actual same mint. Very interesting repunches. It's a small over large. Sometimes they accidentally use two different punches. One of the most dramatic ones is in the bottom left-hand corner there. That it's a 1856 quarter from San Francisco, where they first used a really small S punch, probably intended for a quarter, but then they realized, or probably intended for a dime rather. But then they realized their mistake and tried to just go over it with the one intended for the quarter, and didn't really work. Or maybe they had the right one there and then they accidentally used the one that was intended for $50 or $1. On the right hand side, you can see a Kennedy half from 1968. The mint mark was actually inverted, or it's upside down. Now, true die doubling or a hub doubling, the process is called hubbing when you make dies or hubs. So you could tell this is an example of, it's not a double strike. It was a problem in the production of the hub or the die when they're squeezing them together, and sometimes you get a little bit of a tilt or a little bit of a turn, and as a result, the elements are going to be doubled on the die, and all the coins that are struck from that are going to mirror that exact same doubling. One that I want to point out to you right here, in the middle, that 1974 Kennedy $50, that is from the Denver Mint, and that's a pretty fun one to cherry pick. You can actually look for those in mint sets. So next time you're at a coin show, whenever they may be going on again in person, look for those in 1974 mint sets. You can probably buy one at the cost of the entire mint set. So keep that in mind, coin hunters. So very dramatic hub doubling example right here. The 1955 Lincoln cent, no question. Very popular, very valuable, but not nearly as rare as the 69 San Francisco double die. Can't get into the whole history of it right now, but very fabled die variety. A lot of times there are collectors who think they found a 69 San Francisco double die because they found a coin that had what we call strike doubling, and we'll get into that in just a moment. And then you see a 1943 San Francisco Washington quarter. That's actually listed in the Red Book as one of the better die varieties to collect for the series. Some other examples you can see on a 1983 Lincoln cent, 1901 Morgan dollar. That's a very popular double die reverse. 1946 Liberty Walking $50, and then 1935 Buffalo nickel. You can see the little notches and splits in the word 5 cents there. Now, what we were talking about earlier, machine doubling or mechanical doubling, this is one of the biggest problems that beginners looking to get into error and die variety collecting, this is one of the big problems they run into. A lot of times as a coin is trying to be ejected from the coining chamber, it kind of receives a slight hit or another impression from the dies where you get this false doubled appearance. And you can see there's an example of one from 1969, San Francisco, right in the top there. That is not a true doubled die. And if we go back to the photo before, you'll notice the notches and the splits. There are two distinct elements. There are two of the 1, the 9, the 6, the other 9, and the S. But when you look at the other one that is strike doubled, the elements aren't truly doubled. They're just really kind of flat. This is one of the best ways I can explain this to you. If you look at this photo, this illustration done by Charles Daughtry, really good Lincoln Cent specialist. This is a great example right here of what real true hub doubling looks like, with all the notches and splits and how it's a little extra or extra wide, it's a little thicker. On a machine double or strike doubled coin, it's really kind of shearing the metal, so it's kind of a shelf-like or a flattened appearance. If you look at the photos of the 1972 Lincoln Cent there, that is a true, the result of true die or hub doubling. The Lincoln Cent below that is shelf or machine doubling, not true doubling on the die, but it received that false secondary hit from the dies. This is another wonderful example. It's a photo you can find online. That's where I found it. And it shows how machine doubling and die doubling differ. Machine doubling actually makes the design elements look smaller. True die doubling actually makes them look fatter or wider. So here's an example of on the top left there, that's a doubling that we call Longacre doubling. Anyone familiar with James B. Longacre's coins? The way he designed them, they kind of almost had like this doubled appearance to them. That's just a result of the design, not true doubling. The two coins under it are a result of what we call die fatigue, where the dies that were used to strike them, the elements just got so mushy and worn to the point where it looks like there's doubling there. The other two pictures that you see on the right, the Y and Liberty on a Franklin $50 and a 1963 Lincoln Cent, that's what we call flat field doubling. Remember, proof coins are struck at least twice, so sometimes they don't exactly strike 100% over the first previous strike. They get tilted a little bit, and as a result, that second strike that's coming down flattens some of the elements from that first strike. So a couple of hints and tips before we go today. If you're going to get a glass or a loop for looking at coins, I suggest you use ones that have the word triplet written on them. A triplet loop uses a series of 3 lenses, and it helps reduce the overall distortion towards the periphery or towards the edges. So it's a lot easier to use that. You want to use a good quality one, but the right power is also important. 5 to 10 power is really good for grading purposes, but if you're trying to lock in on die varieties and you're trying to see doubling, a 10 to 20 power loop is ideal for that. Personally, I use a 14 power loop when I'm looking at die varieties. I use a 5 or a 7 when I'm grading coins. If you use anything that's higher than 20 power, I mean, I'll get sometimes people who will send in pictures of coins they took with like 40 power magnification. And Bill Fiva, one of the authors of the Cherry Pickers Guide, I remember talking to him about this years ago, and he told me, Sam, you don't want to try separating the fly poop from the pepper. Don't make such a big deal about the BNDs, or barely noticeable differences. If you have to use a glass that's so strong to notice something like that, it's not really worth the time and effort more often than not. So nothing higher than about a 20 if you're going to be doing dye variety hunting. And when you do buy dye varieties, make sure you're buying the entire coin, because you'll have to pay for the entire coin, not just the variety. When I was first starting off as a dye variety collector, I was just looking, at elements, looking for doubling, looking for repunches, misplaced things, and sometimes be real happy about the coin I would just buy, and then you get it home and you realize, oh man, one side of it is all scratched up. So understand, damage on any coin, a problem coin is still a problem coin. So you can buy them easy, but hard to sell. Please, when going out and cherry picking, be respectful of dealers. That is their livelihood. This is what they do for a living. It's not always nice to just sit at their table for hours on end, only to spend maybe $5. If you knew everything that's involved with having to be a dealer, you might think otherwise at cherry picking efforts that might have you sitting there for an hour only to spend $1. So maybe buy a couple other things too. Maybe might help ward you off their scent too if they think you're trying to just cherry pick things. Don't be afraid to be honest with a dealer and let them know that that's what you're doing. A lot of times, you don't have to give them all the information, but don't have to necessarily lie either. A dye variety on a coin that's already expensive isn't going to change the price much. If you're going to start dye variety hunting, I don't suggest just going right out there and looking at $20 gold pieces. They're already pretty expensive. I also wouldn't go out and look for dye varieties or errors on key date coins. A lot of people might think, well, it's an 09 SVDB and it's got a strike through on it, so it should be worth more. It's actually the opposite. Key date coins and really valuable coins, people kind of want to collect them problem free. So if you find an error on a key date, kind of lowers the value in a weird way. So just something to keep in mind. Something else I want to go over with you, because we always say in this hobby to buy the book before you buy the coin. It's a very important thing to do. Education is paramount importance in this hobby. I've shared things with friends of mine over the years, and I say, man, look what I just found. And they'll say, wow, Sam, you are so lucky. Can't believe you found that coin. And I'll tell them, well, I can believe it. Why not? I should be that lucky. I prepared. Understand that being lucky with dye variety hunting or much of anything else is really when all the preparation you've done ahead of time comes together with an opportunity. If you have prepared and you have studied, then when you go out into the field looking at coins, you may have this same success or same luck. So I strongly suggest, reading as much as possible about the topic. Meet with other collectors, join coin clubs, read books, go online. Be careful, though, with a lot of websites that talk about errors, especially things like YouTube, where they might say, yes, this quarter is worth $40,000 because I said it was. Understand, there's a lot of clickbait out there on the internet. So it's a little bit trickier, but if you are going to go online and you want to learn a lot more about coin, dye varieties, and errors, write these two websites down or take a screenshot right now. Koneka Online, I mentioned that one before, and we showed it to you. We also mentioned Variety Vista. These are two of the best websites. Also, error-ref.com is another wonderful one to learn a lot about error coins. So in just a little while, we're going to be breaking and go into another session where we're going to talk about if you have any questions. So I thank you very, very much for joining me today. If you're going to stay on, I think this meeting will probably be ending. Brianne might have more information for us about that in just a moment here. But we will be going into another meeting momentarily. So thank you very much. And hopefully I'll be speaking with some of y'all in just a couple moments when we go into our next session, which will last for about an hour.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam, so much. I'm now going to launch the survey, so please take the time to take that survey. It's only 10 questions and it's multiple choice, so it's very, very easy. So here it is. So Sam, do you want to answer a couple of questions before we go, or?
Sure. I guess we could do that.
Okay, perfect. So before we start on that, he did just mention we're going to do a live question and answer. I'm going to put the link for that in the chat in just a second. So if you're wanting to jump on that, you will be able to. It does hold only 100 people. So first 100 people will get in. That's who's going to be able to participate.
Does that include me? Do I need to run?
What?
Sorry, does that include me? Do I need to go run and do that right now?
Yeah, I'll make sure you get in. Don't worry. Yes.
Thank you.
Then we have no show. So I'll make sure Sam's in there. I'll get in there, and then we'll let everybody else in. So Sam, your first question that came in said, let's see here. Sorry, there was a whole bunch. You had a whole bunch of come in. Like I said in the other ones, if we can't get to your questions, we will. I'll send them to Sam, and he will answer them, and we'll get them out to everybody. So, is it possible for a blank planchet to be struck with a weak strike S mint mark, then to be transferred to the Denver Mint to be developed with a coin with a D mint mark?
Well, all right. Well, first of all, blank planchet. Which one? They're two different things. Okay. All right. So it's an already struck coin. I'm sorry. I need that question one more time.
Yeah. Let me reread it to you. Is it possible for a blank planchet to be struck with a weak strike S mint mark, then transferred to the Denver Mint to be developed into the coin with a D mint mark?
Well, the die, or because they're saying a blank or a planchet, that wouldn't make sense that a struck coin would go on to another mint. So I'm not exactly sure what. If that person who asked that question, if you want to personally send me that in an email, and we can probably go into that. I'm not exactly sure what. Yeah, the wording in that question, it's a little tricky. It's kind of like me asking you, which is faster, to New York or by plane? So.
Yes. So, and this person that asked this question, you can jump onto the live session here pretty soon with us. You might be able to ask it there. So, all right. Your next question, it says, are there any coins that have rainbow toning? I'm sorry. Are any coins that have rainbow toning rare?
They could be, I suppose, but it's not really a result of the minting process. It's a result of corrosion, something that would happen after the process. So it's not really an applicable question in this conversation, unfortunately. I mean, I could talk about toned coins. I'm a fan of them, but can't really get into that right now. Just because it has not a whole lot to do with the striking process. It could have something to do with the metals in the alloy, but yeah, that's a story for another time.
Awesome. Let's see here. Oh, I lost it. Sorry. Due to the mint changing to a single squeeze, what is your opinion on the newer doubled die classes? Does this mean there's now a new class 9, and what would that new class be?
I do not know. That sounds like a better question for Dr. Wiles. That's pretty specific. I'm not sure what that would be, but yeah, there are about 8 classes of die varieties. The most popular one being class 1, where it's rotated from that central point. That's a pretty good question. I like that one. That one might be a good one to ask Dr. Wiles when that person comes out for summer seminar.
Yes, definitely.
Again, guys, it's a survey. It's only we took, again, how long is the course at summer seminar? 20?
It's about 22 class hours, and
yeah.
About 2.
So. Yeah, so understand it. It's trying to distill all that information, down is I mean, yes, there were things that I mentioned that I didn't explain as well as I could have, because again, 2 hours. So that's why we're trying to have that extra hour here that I guess we're going to be doing in about a minute, right?
Yeah, well, let's answer maybe 2 more.
Sure, I'm okay with that.
How were galvanos transferred to the blank steel before this technology was invented?
Through an electrolysis process. An electrolyte solution would have like a host where I mean, that's really technical, where electrons are bombarding the surface with metal, and they just kind of, yeah, it's a really tricky question to get into right here. But before that, yeah, in earlier times, yeah, that's a pretty tricky one. Again, summer seminar awaits.
Definitely. All right, let's do one more. Again, if we don't get to your question today, I will email these out to Sam, or you can jump on the live session here in just a minute. But one more question for you, Sam.
Sure.
Why do incomplete blanks not fall through the screens in the Riddler and get removed?
They usually do. They don't always. Sometimes they may be laying on top of something and it didn't allow for it to get swept away by a Riddler. Understand there's tons of these things going into a Riddler all at once, so they might not all get filtered out. Sometimes you even get blanks. Coins are struck on blanks sometimes, not even planchets. All depends. If possible, if you're ever able to take a tour of a mint production floor, it would answer so many questions you didn't even realize you had. Unfortunately, I don't think the U.S. mints really do private floor tours anymore. I said earlier, I was able to do one in 2006, but that I don't know if they would even be willing to entertain that anymore. I don't think that's something they even do anymore.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam, so much for putting this presentation together for us. If you jump onto the live session with us, we welcome you and hope to have you there. Sam, we have a certificate of appreciation coming to you for all the work that you have done.
Thank you.
Presentation is going to be tomorrow. That's going to be with Michael Fay and John Baumgart. They're going to teach on collecting and investing in Morgan dollars, a comprehensive approach. That class is maxed out as well. So if you can't get into that one, we'll have the recording on the website in a week or so. Again, thanks everybody for joining us. And if you're going on to the live session, you'll be put in the waiting room until I let you in. So hopefully we'll see you guys there. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone.